Fast, agile and secretive, Tobi-Kadachi have been noted as a challenge to study by the guild. A life in the treetops doesn't make observations any easier, but here we'll do our best to piece together the snippets of Toby's behaviour and ecology to uncover more about the jungle livewire. First off, a huge thanks to Bonecrusher Hyena for sponsoring this video with a Zora Magdaros patron tier. Their support is greatly appreciated. As ever, I hope it's worth it. Whilst Toby is far from the first monster to use gliding, it does so in perhaps the densest environment a glider has been seen in yet, with the largest trees. This of course being the ancient forest of the New World. Whilst Toby currently seems to spend a surprising amount of time on the jungle floor, for something so vulnerable to Anjanath and for something so well adapted to the treetops, this may stem from the theory that there aren't as many giant trees in the ancient forest as there used to be. See Puki's video for how Rathalos's arrival in the ancient forest may have changed the landscape significantly. So Toby may well have evolved in a denser and more heavily forested environment, and be more adapted to such a place, which is where the gliding comes from. Like as is believed in flying squirrels, gliding can be one way to slow one's own momentum when landing. Toby is still a big heavy animal with a minimal interest in crash landing, and as the most agile and arboreal of its group, it may have its patagium to slow itself down on particularly big leaps. This could also be the reason why some flightless wyverns like Tigrex retain wings. As we can see, even with said wings slowing their descent, they can often have quite hard landings. Even species that often seem to dive bomb intentionally, like Barioth or Seregios, may actually engage in precisely calculated ascents, rather than the reckless games of chicken they seem to be, and neither appear able to sustain an impact that goes badly wrong. Tough as various wyverns may be, once they reach a certain velocity from certain heights, they may need extra equipment to stop a damaging crash. Gliding can have a number of functions in the clades that have gliding membranes, and for Toby it may have initially represented a time and partial energy saving measure. In Colugos, gliding doesn't actually save energy contrary to earlier beliefs. It's actually more expensive to glide to a lower point on the tree, and then climb back to the canopy, than it is to just hop and climb your way through the canopy itself. What Colugos do save is time, that for both sexes can be spent foraging, and for males can be spent chasing away other males or looking for females. And time saving may well still be a big factor for Toby. It is also worth noting as a climbing and gliding wyvern several thousand times the mass of a Colugo, unlike them, gliding may still represent a major energetic saving for Toby. Whereas moving through the canopy is cheapest of all, Toby's still considerable bulk may have prevented true canopy traversal over much of its evolutionary history. Gliding from trunk to trunk is more expensive than canopy climbing, but it's also a lot cheaper than completely descending to the bottom, walking to the next tree, and then reclimbing the same thing in its entirety. Colugos generally don't seem to have locomotion as a major energetic stressor, and that may be why they can afford to go for quicker movement over more efficient. This may be a similarity partly shared with Toby as well, who is curiously described as having a low metabolic rate, and capable of going for reasonable gaps between feeding despite its presumed diet of small prey. It's unknown if Toby has certain time periods it prefers to hunt in. The World Book does seem to reference predatory attacks on guild personnel occurring in the day, but Toby's large eyes, occupation of the dense undergrowth, and potential radiation into the more troglodytic viper, which seems to see in the dark excellently, may all suggest it's a capable night hunter, with a possible preference for it too. Whichever Toby prefers, it may only have a limited window in which it can hunt at maximum effectiveness, and with Murnos presumably creating quite a racket in a failed attempt, it may need to find a new hunting ground some distance away if the initial pounce fails. And Toby may well be something of an all-or-nothing hunter, only really striking in careful stalks where it stands a good chance of success, and isn't given to opportunistic flights of fancy. The World Book mentions it as both a persistent hunter and almost always striking from behind, and considering the lack of feeding observations, one would assume this comes from attempts on hunters and guild personnel. Indeed, as a small prey specialist and a relatively non-combative animal outside of the occasional preference for a warrior's death, Toby's fights are likely them attempting to predate the hunter, and Toby is one such monster that views the hunter and humans/wyverians in general as a valid prey item over a threat. Otherwise, Murnos do seem to be the most reasonable suggestion for the bulk of Toby diet in a pre-Rathalos forest, and they still likely make up a fair chunk of it today. Toby's unique jaw and dentition are very poorly suited to chewing and stressful tasks, and accordingly it's believed to swallow prey whole, with potential for some jaw dislocation to do so, or cranial kinesis. Lacking both the impressive jaws and teeth of great Jaguars, as well as its highly distensible stomach, Toby's prey range is likely relatively small. The two likely stack up against each other much as actual snakes do, with mobility and prey size being the factors that divide. Ambush foraging allows for a greater breadth of prey taken as well as larger prey, with the more sedentary great Jaguars either digesting its huge meals or regurgitating them for its pack, as well as being better equipped to quickly kill large prey in a single strike with its huge and powerful jaws. Much as an active forager snake takes smaller prey so it can keep moving efficiently, the generally more active and climbing Toby has to keep a trimmer figure for life in the treetops, even if it may rest or at least not hunt again for a considerable time period too after a good meal. Murnos do seem ideal in a lot of respects here. If swallowed head first, they'd go down relatively easily. They're abundant, and they often come to the large trees Toby lives in to feed. The one thing holding them back is that they're relatively swift and wary animals, that are presumably hard to catch and require a lot of speed and stealth. But the dense canopy does also hamper swift flight and escape, even with how maneuverable Murnos have been shown to be. Any chases that occur are likely races to the outer canopy, where the thinner, more open branches would ultimately hamper Toby's pursuit. In the modern and more open forest, Toby may now hunt a lot more on the ground due to lessened tree cover. On the forest floor, there is still plenty small game to attract it, with Jaguars, Kelby and Mosswine all being targets that could conceivably go down the hatch in one go. The incredibly successful Kelby are widespread enough that on a habitat level, they can be reliably hunted in the deeper forest, and Mosswine are very likely abundant in the interior too. The greater numbers of mushrooms, as well as fallen fruit and nuts, presumably keep them well fed. And they're both slow and incautious animals that likely make for an ideal snack for any carnivore, and a fair chunk of Toby's diet, with their portly build making them a good meal. Prey shape, as well as prey size, may hamper predation too, and Kestodon bulls, at least, are presumably too awkward to swallow even if they were smaller, with the large bony head crests getting in the way. We also see this in snakes that swallow things whole. The prey shape can also be quite important too. Long items like lizards or salamanders are generally preferred, as they go down a lot easier than bulky prey that it's hard to get your mouth around, and hard to get down your esophagus too. But some snakes may still occasionally kill things too big for them to swallow too out of instinct, and the fact they generally can't measure prey before striking, and so may Toby, or rather the subspecies. Viper still at least has some small prey to take advantage of like Cortos, but Anteka may provide a similar problem to Kestodon bulls, what with their broad antlers. It's also mentioned to hunt Popo, and with the very young calves it can swallow them whole, but curiously it is also seen to bring back chunks of meat to its lair, ostensibly from the larger adults. With the mouth poorly made to shear and cut, it could be most likely that Viper just pulls this meat free. The front fangs are actually seemingly odontoids made of scale, rather than true teeth, or perhaps maybe more analogous to a beak, and if hooked could potentially be used to work and pull flesh free from a carcass. With sharp claws it keeps in good condition. It's not impossible that Base nor Viper could possibly consume larger prey partially, opening the carcass to eat organs and shearing off meat to stash too. Why Base Toby doesn't is intriguing. It's likely not due to a more competitive environment, as both the hoarfrost and ancient forest are roughly equally rife with larger and hostile predators. Rather, it may be a question of energy, and temperature's relation to it. Viper may potentially have a considerably quicker metabolism to generate heat that way, if it struggles to stay warm in the hoarfrost. Such an action would require much more food, and so force Viper's hand to both hunt more if going for small prey, and slash or to hunt larger prey, and eat more in the initial sitting, but also to take meat back to its caves for later. Whilst the warm caves may speed decay, The meat presumably isn't kept long enough for it to degrade too badly before it's eaten. This may be another reason why base Toby doesn't do this. In the warm and humid ancient forest, ants, maggots and microorganisms may consume any meat it tries to cache too quickly. With so many large competitors outside for Viper, it may be near impossible for it to cache food without it getting stolen before it returns, as well as Viper apparently trying to avoid trips into the cold. Viper is specified to apparently prefer the warm caves, and is suggested to be poorly suited to the cold of the hoarfrost due to its lack of insulation. Why Capcom decided to bring this up now is anyone's guess. Some have suggested that Viper may well be in the opposite of hot water, since Shara's actions rendered the volcano dormant. But whilst the Hoarfrost Reach is apparently the coldest Arctic map known, it's also clearly been a boreal environment for a long time, from the vegetation and fauna, even if not as cold. It's also presumably a seasonal environment that we see in its winter, with warmer and greener conditions for at least a fair chunk of the year, when Viper would be less cold-stressed. Tobi-Kadachi in general seem to rely on areas of cover, either forested terrain, very broken terrain, or both. As such, much of their distribution is mainly in the coastal areas of the New World, that are kept lush by the rain shadow over much of it. Toby's presence in the Shrine Ruins too suggests that it can handle temperate forests, and its New World range may extend quite far north along the coast for as long as the forests do, going from tropical to subtropical to temperate to boreal. How and where the split into Viper happened is hard to say, and the Hoarfrost Reach also being an island doesn't help. It may be possible and likely that the Reach was connected to the mainland New World some time ago, with Toby getting marooned there by a changing world and partially speciating into Viper. The need for larger prey and more food is likely what brought on the development of the assorted toxins Viper has, and uses to subjugate large prey it has little hope of swallowing whole. Like some snakes, Viper has multiple types of venom, both a hemotoxic one and a neurotoxic one. The former causes internal bleeding, and also seems to be a soft confirmation that the poison status effect is hemotoxin, and the latter causes partial or full paralysis. The reason for two different venoms is apparently one being for predation and the other being for anti-predation. And this does seem a good a theory as any. There has been little argument for why some snakes have multiple types of venom, but at least some with this trait, like the Rinkol's cobra, have one mechanism that's for anti-predator defense, specifically the venom they spit. Some, like the Amazon puffing snake, have different types of toxins in the venom for different types of prey as well. So the notion of different toxins for different opponents isn't without reason. It is surprising that Toby didn't develop a form of cytotoxin that may begin chemical digestion of prey and allow Viper to better work around consuming such items. But presumably the weight involved may have been too risky, and led to kills getting stolen too. Paralysis presumably allows Viper to quickly disable and start eating and caching meat, whilst the prey is still alive, as well as partially limiting some of the risks of sensory detection from a more normal kill on large prey. A cytotoxin may also help for anti-predator defense as well, though rather this is the hemotoxin's job instead. Whilst it would encourage local bleeding where Viper's quills punctured an attacking opponent, it is hard to say how much of a deterrent this would be to other large predators, when presumably this would be undetectable as an unpleasant sensation to trigger them breaking off the attack. In base Toby, this rather takes the form of electricity, with seemingly little use in predation. As seen against Anjanath, the chief reason generally seems to be anti-predator defense, providing a painful deterrent for anything trying to grapple with Toby. Historically, its chief threat may have been Nagakuga, who is larger, more powerful, and capable of both ambush and following Toby into the trees. Against a foe essentially outclassing it in every way, its final resort of activating its electrical coat may well have been a lifesaver. In the current ancient forest, Toby may have arguably fared better than New World Nagakuga, by being better suited to more patchwork forests, and possibly having even more abundant food sources, as despite being a forest animal it may not be as selective as some think, still able to handle changes in the terrain leading to more open forests, and generally becoming a more ground-bound animal. Following Toby in the New World, it often descends to the forest floor, rather than ascending further in the canopy. This may make Anjanath its main threat too, and despite often hunting Aptonoth on the coastal plain, it appears to regularly forage in the forest too, often combining that with persecuting smaller predators as well. Considering it seems to be intent on eating the great jaguars it kills, Anjanath likely also views Toby as food rather than a competitor, and so may pursue it to some degree outside of just opportunistic encounters as well. A final and important rival is of course other Toby. Whilst it's unknown how the females behave, the males will apparently compete in showy displays of who has the longer tail, with researchers believing that tail length indicates male quality in Tobi-Kadachi. Possibly both sexes also vigorously mark territory, rubbing quills off and clawing tree bark as their main form of boundary marking. In the ancient forest around Astera, this seems to be focused at the base of the ancient tree, and like some other animals, Toby may have certain preferences for repeatedly using the same boundary spots due to their prevalence in the landscape. In a more open patchwork forest, Toby will likely still be partially dependent on the giant trees, even if they can handle more open areas, and so the large trees will often be key resources to defend and show that this area is currently occupied. Proceed with caution. Other Toby will be drawn to the tree, so rather than risky ventures across its whole territory, Toby prefer to mark the most important thing in it, that everyone will show up to anyway. So despite being one of the most mysterious denizens of the known world, Toby still has a rich suite of interesting behaviours. Overall, I really like Toby. He's really one of those monsters who doesn't have a weak spot in what he does. A fast environmental fight, a source of early game thunder that isn't Kezu, the glider monster of world, and I guess technically Rise too, and overall with a really nice design that fits with said environment too, as well as looking quite unique overall. Toby also just has a lot of personality, with his little cartoon rodent squeaks and how he shakes and shimmers in his fight, as if he's psyching himself up for combat. Whilst Rise Toby does lose some of that personality with a more stripped down presentation, also eliminating any environmental moves too, its curious bump up the roster to the same tier as Barioth and Rathian did also turn it into a more of a glass cannon. He's far less forgiving with pauses between his moves, chaining attacks and higher damage as befitting his higher rank, although he still dies as fast or quicker than World, with Rise's wild buffs to the hunter. But overall he was probably one of the better ported World originals. It does seem that this overall quality is recognised to some degree in the fanbase too, being at 69th place in the popularity poll and beating out several higher profile monsters. Whilst Basil is probably the 5th gen monster who's most securely fastened his status as a series classic the quickest, the fact Toby provides a more fun alternative to Kezu for an early thunder monster, boosts Fanged wyvern diversity, and the ubiquity of forest maps he could easily be slotted into, all make me think he won't just be limited to 5th gen in the series' future. But with that, let me also tell you how I've ruined Toby for myself, in that I think Toby would be perfect for the Coral Highlands, and actually worth more there than in the ancient forest. First and foremost, Toby completes the theme of the Highlands in that the ability to utilise wind currents makes for a more successful monster there. So right now things go walk, float, fly, with Tsitsi, Palumu and Legiana. If we had Toby between Tsitsi and Palumu, his gliding would bridge the gap between walking and floating. Walking isn't using the currents at all, gliding is a controlled and stylised fall, floating is flight without control, and flight is actual flight. On top of this, it would add a good monster to a relatively depauperate Highlands that could do with an extra cast member or two, and takes out one from the somewhat overstacked ancient forest, the latter already having 5 residents and also serving as Cooler's introduction, instead of his native map that he really should have been introduced in, the Wildspire, compared to the 3 natives and occasional visits from Odogaron the Highlands had. Toby would also just fit too. All of his environmental attacks would be well utilised in the verticalness of the Highland map, and his pale blue coloration would look in place as well. The only thing he'd really lose is his turf war with Anjanath, which is something that really says and does more for Anjanath than it does for Toby. Then we have Viper, who's okay, not quite reaching the heights of Iceborne's Ebony, Fulgur or Coral, or its variants, but better than most old-gen subspecies easily. The double poison feature I actually think is quite cool, and wouldn't mind seeing more monsters lean into that gimmick too. As with many environmental monsters, the fight is partially weakened by taking him out of his habitat though. I've always thought with his coloration and general vibe, he'd fit a lot better in the Wildspire than the Hoarfrost, and you could potentially give it some environmental moves from the ledges and caverns there. But overall, okay. Not great, not terrible. In some ways with Toby overall, I do think he's a bit slept on vibes-wise. In both World and Iceborne with Viper, we get the impression Toby is one of a few monsters who doesn't view the hunter as a threat, but more just as food. And in both cases, but especially Viper again, it's successfully given an intimidating intro of stalking the hunter. I think Toby as a dedicated man-eater is an interesting angle they could lean into in future media, if not just future games, to give a little more juice to some of the earlier game monsters, and possibly a bigger role in the story too. Anyways, thanks for watching. And again, a huge thanks to top patron Bonecrusher Hyena for sponsoring this video, as well as Toxic Wolf, The Superest Duper, Samburgo, K. Sandom, Octavia of the Fifth Fleet, Nickname 3110, Erengar Steiny, Kieran McCarthy, Flygon's Archives, Hui Hui, Jabin, The Belted Horned Warbler, Nathan Cross, Tim Gojira, Teddy KGB, Waffle, Dapperuptor, Godzilla Prime 2, Original Username, Evilly, Howleth, Archosaur Queen, Tommy Choi, Jacob Wilcox, Seth Fake Last Name, Zeusir, Dodecablos, and Bazugazu Bachumatsu, whose generosity helps keep the channel going. Thanks to Kamen Rider Moten and Dragonmaster for their excellent digital artwork of Tobi-Kadachi they made for this video. For more of both their work, and from Carmen the opportunity to commission your own pieces, their links to their assorted social media are provided in the description below. Thanks to I Am the Kaiju King for creating the Toby skull. For more skeletals, custom artwork and Monster Hunter theories, be sure to follow him on his Tumblr too, linked in the description below. And thanks to Glide Borealis for his video of Viper Tobi-Kadachi harvesting its meat. Be sure to check out his channel for many documentaries on Monster Hunter and other franchises too. Like I've said some time ago, Toby is a monster I like, but one that requires a lot more speculation, as the actual confirmed lore on him is quite sparse, on purpose as he's a mysterious monster, hence why he's taken a very long time to get to, or rather why a patron funded him instead. Bonecrusher did provide a lot of their own theories and questions to help smoothen things too. All the comments provided last time for Akantor and Yukonlos's video were appreciated, which was also a pretty speculation heavy one, as we're really starting to run out of monsters now. And it was also never the plan to cover everyone to start with, but for next time,